we should accept. Buonasera a tutte e a tutti e benvenute a questo seminario degli Alumni Levi Live, un gruppo di giovani studiose e studiosi della Fondazione Levi di Venezia. Ehm, io sono Daniele Palma, assegnista di ricerca all'Università di Bologna. Con me questa sera ci sono Alexandre Piré, il collega Alexandre Piré, dottorando di ricerca in musicologia, e il professor Mark Katz, che introdurrò. L'incontro di oggi si svolgerà in inglese. Io ho iniziato in italiano, ma adesso passo immediatamente all'inglese, so I'll switch to English and repeat. Welcome to everybody to this first seminar of the Alumni Levi Live edition for 2024. I'm Daniele Palma. Together with me tonight, there will be Alexandre Piré, my colleague Alexandre Piré, and Professor Mark Katz will be our host for this seminar. I just briefly introduced to you our guest, which is an international guest, and the topic of this seminar, which will be, we hope, very interesting to everybody. So, Mark Katz is John P. Baker Distinguished Professor of Music at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research focuses on music and technology, hip-hop, cultural diplomacy, music and incarceration, and violence, a quite wide array of topics. On these subjects, he has written 5 books, one of which I personally recall as one of the Bibles during my PhD studies, which is Capturing Sound, How Technology Has Changed Music, which was published in 2004, and then a revised edition in 2010. More recent titles include Build, The Power of Hip-Hop Diplomacy in a Divided World, published in 2019, and Mark is currently working on a co-authored book with incarcerated musician Aline Braxton. In 2013, Mark became the founding director of Next Level, a program funded by the US Department of State, which sends the US hip-hop artists abroad to foster cultural exchange and entrepreneurship. His work in promoting the arts and music education in underserved communities has been recognized through several awards, such as those from the Freedoms Foundation, the Hip Hop Education Center, and Indie Weekly. In light of these activities, as well as this groundbreaking scholarship, in 2016, the Royal Musical Association awarded Mark the Dent Medal, recognizing him for taking musicology and hip-hop studies in bold new directions, creating a model of exemplary and ethical scholarship that internationalizes the discipline in productive ways. Well, the starting point for today's seminar is Mark's latest book for Oxford University Press, which is this one, Music and Technology, a very short introduction. It is one of the very short introduction in the so-called series by Oxford University Press. So I would like to define it as a highly portable and pleasantly repeatable technological piece of musical culture, one that makes us rethink this very culture beyond the conventional boundaries of both music and technology. Indeed, as Mark clearly states at the beginning of the volume, page 17, I quote, "History has no record of a pre-technological age of music. Humans are and have always been creatures of technology and of music." Well, if we acknowledge this simple truth, some questions arise. How and in what ways are the histories of music and technology intertwined? And what does it mean to understand music itself as a technology? And what are the consequences of such a perspective? As we shall see, framing music in technological terms means, first and foremost, to explore the multifarious relationships between bodies, instruments, and media in light of changing values, imaginaries, and power mechanisms. My role today will be mainly that of coordinating and raising some questions on specific topics in the last part of the seminar. On the other hand, my colleague and friend Alexandre will contribute to the debate by proposing a short case study from his doctoral dissertation. This case study will concern Toots Thielemans. In particular, Alexandre will explain how Thielemans' artistic journey could be better understood by including the technologies that he encountered in his very long 17 years old career and understanding how these technologies helped to shape his music. Well, without any further hesitation, I'll now hand the floor over to Mark Katz, thanking him for being present today. I hand the floor over him to share with us his remarks on the fascinating topic of this seminar. Thank you, Mark.
Well, first of all, welcome to everyone. Thank you for watching, but thank you to Dr. Palma and the foundation for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you. So what I decided to do to share my thoughts on this subject is to offer a condensed version of the final chapter of the book, which is called 5 Theses About Music and Technology. And it's I find it's an efficient way to give an overview of the book, but also to prompt discussion. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have a few slides for us to see as I'm talking. Okay, and I hope you can see this now. Great. So as this says, it's a very short introduction to music and technology, a very short introduction. And so, as I said, these are 5 theses about music and technology. So to be clear, by thesis, this is an argument. You don't have to agree with it. It is not an objective truth. So this is meant to, I do think all of these arguments are true, but I offer them in the spirit of conversation and even argumentation. That is, so please do feel free to argue with me. So my first thesis is all music is technological. Many societies, particularly in the West, observe a dichotomy between the technological and the natural. The two are often thought of as fundamentally distinct categories. Mapped onto music, live music is natural, while mechanically or electronically created and disseminated music is technological. But these are not distinct categories. Both describe human-made technologies used to transmit sound. Another way to understand the dichotomy is as the opposition between live or unmediated music and recorded or mediated music. But all music, whether live or recorded, is mediated. In the simplest sense, a medium is a substance or space between two objects, and a medium always shapes or influences that which it mediates. Even if I sing to myself, the air around me and my own body mediate the sound before it is converted into electrical signals interpreted by my brain. It is impossible to draw a bright line between the organic and the technological. We blur this line further when we incorporate the non-organic into our bodies, whether ear trumpets, hearing aids, or cochlear implants. We have been challenging the distinction between the organic and the technological for centuries. To insist that all music is technological is not to erase what is interesting, different, or remarkable about the variety of ways in which we create and experience music. Quite the opposite. For example, some insist that live music is better than recorded music. In this view, live music is authentic, spontaneous, and real, while recordings are artificial, manufactured, and cold. But others favor recorded music because it offers greater convenience and control, a haven from the distractions of noisy, uncomfortable venues. Partisans make equally adamant claims about their preferred mode of listening and say that it is the purer musical experience. But purism is a dead end, serving mostly to tout one's superiority, diminish the values of others, and limit rather than cultivate discussion and exchange. Live performances and sound recordings simply offer different ways of experiencing music. Recognizing both as technological and mediated allows us to identify and compare their distinctive affordances, limitations, and benefits. It empowers us to decide under what conditions we are better served by one or the other, and to avail ourselves of a broader array of musical experiences. And by the way, the illustration that you see on this slide is of a piano action. And I share that to show that the piano, which we think of as obviously a musical instrument, is also a very complex piece of technology. So that goes to my thesis that all music, whether it's an ancient instrument or the newest, most cutting edge technology, is a form of technology. So my second thesis is that our relationship with music technology is fundamentally collaborative. Technology is often said to make our lives easier, to take care of work we once had no choice but to do. Consumer technologies, dishwashers, coffee makers, sewing machines, electric drills, and the like are marketed as labor-saving devices. In reality, technology tends not to eliminate labor, but to redistribute it or create the opportunity or need for different kinds of labor. Work is still required to operate, clean, maintain, and repair those technologies. Music technologies are often conceived of in the same way, though labor saving has often been seen as a negative. A common critique of music technology is that it devalues the art precisely because it makes some aspect of it either easier or unnecessary. This is a view we ought to resist, because it obscures the fact that our relationship with music technology is fundamentally collaborative. So, for example, what is the difference between a traditional piano and a player piano? The most obvious distinction would seem to be that one requires a human to play it, while the other plays itself. But the matter isn't so simple. During its heyday at the turn of the 20th century, most player pianos required humans to operate pedals and levers to add nuances of tempo, phrasing, and dynamics. These nuances made each performance unique. Moreover, they demanded a skill set different from that needed to play the traditional piano. People even studied manuals and took lessons on how to become a good pianolist, the term popular among the technology. Pianola was a common name for the instrument at the time. And by the way, you see an image of a manual for pianola players. And also you see a picture of someone operating a player piano. The player piano is not then a technology that wholly eliminates musical, or I should say human labor. Conversely, the traditional piano can also be seen as a labor-saving technology. The sound of the piano is the sound of felt-covered wooden hammers striking wire strings. But pianists generally do not touch the strings or hammers. This is done via a complex mechanism known as the piano's action. The action of a grand piano consists of 20 different parts of varying sizes, shapes, and materials, and the pianist touches only one of them, the keys. The piano and the piano player do not stand on, or I should say, the piano and the player piano do not stand on opposite sides of a divide, where one side represents human-made music and the other machine-made music. They stand along a continuum, differing in the degree to which they automate the music making and in the distribution of musical labor between player and instrument. All musical labor is in some way distributed, a collaboration between humans and the technologies they engage. Trying to demarcate hard boundaries in cases like this is a losing proposition. It is far better to avoid rigid hierarchies and instead seek commonalities among the vast possibilities of musical creation. So I'm offering the kind of provocative argument that the traditional piano and the player piano are not actually that different from each other, or that they differ in terms of degree rather than terms of kind. My third thesis is that all uses of music technology reveal power relationships. On August 31st, 1939, the New York Times published a one-sentence article titled "Nazi Radio Says It with Music." The entire piece reads, "Each German news broadcast, with its reports of Polish chauvinism and alleged atrocities against German nationals, begins and ends with a stirring martial tune called The March of the Germans in Poland. The next day, September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, initiating World War II. This song and the broadcasts that it bookended were one piece of a national strategy dating to the beginning of the Nazi regime. In its first year in power, 1933, the Third Reich released the People's Receiver, an inexpensive radio created at the request of Joseph Goebbels, one of Adolf Hitler's most devoted associates and the head of the Reich Ministry of Public Engagement and Propaganda, the agency that enforced Nazi ideology. The Nazis recognized the political value of the radio. It is obvious from programming of music like the March of the Germans in Poland and print advertisements such as the one announcing all of Germany listens to the Führer with the People's Receiver. And by the way, on the left side of this slide, that's a photo of these People's Receivers or radios being distributed. The Nazis embraced radio as a propaganda tool, a means to whip up support for the regime's war effort and to justify the genocide that led to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. Radio helped the regime expand and direct its power over citizens, allies, and enemies alike. Although this is an extreme case, the Nazi use of radio illustrates how power relations underlie, motivate, and are articulated by the manifold ways in which humans engage with technologies, and music technologies in particular. The exercise and flow of power in the use of music technology is dazzlingly varied, as are the lessons to be drawn. Nazi radio, as well as the US military's deployment of sound recordings as a form of torture in the early 2000s, demonstrate the vast scope of music's power when conscripted to serve reprehensible state-sanctioned ends. At the same time, these examples undercut a solely utopian view of music. The flow of power is neither predictable nor easily controlled, and there are striking cases in which music is deployed as a tool to subvert power structures. The US folk musician Woody Guthrie very directly used his voice to oppose the Nazi regime, writing songs denouncing, ridiculing, and threatening Adolf Hitler. Sometime in the early 1940s, he painted the phrase, "This machine kills fascists," on the side of his acoustic guitar. You could see that on the image on the right. He had borrowed the phrase from factory workers manufacturing material for the war effort, who wrote that phrase, "This machine kills fascists," on their lathes and drill presses. For Guthrie, it seems, his guitar was another tool in the war effort. But there's another lesson to be drawn from these examples. In perhaps every case in which a form of technology is used against its generally accepted purpose for musical ends, it can be understood as a means to exert control and express power. In the case of musical propaganda and torture, it is the oppressors wielding the technology. But it is usually only in extreme cases that those in power subvert technological norms. Typically, they set the norms. More often, oppressed or marginalized peoples are the ones hacking or tweaking musical technologies. We can see this in Trinidad, where the steel drum was developed in response to prohibitions against the use of drums with animal skins among the descendants of enslaved peoples. We can see this in the way the accordion, introduced by French colonists, was modified in Madagascar to become a virtuosic instrument used in religious ceremonies. We see this in the way DJs in New York City scratched records instead of playing them in the traditional way and created a whole new sonic vocabulary. Whether the music is meant to be aggressive or laid back, angry or joyous, these are acts of sonic resistance in the face of oppression. My fourth thesis is the mass mediation of music has not eliminated cultural differences. Sometime in 1985, Zimbabwean brothers Akim and Dumisani Ndlovu saw an American movie that changed their lives, Beat Street. And you see the picture of that duo from the 80s on the left. Set in the South Bronx, New York, Beat Street celebrates the hip-hop arts of the DJ, dancer, rapper, and graffiti writer. The brothers were most inspired by the dance scenes, returning to watch Beat Street again and again, then staging impromptu dance performances outside the Harare Theater for exiting filmgoers. Because of the globalization and popularity of US hip-hop, it's not surprising that many budding hip-hop artists learn by imitating what they see and hear. This may mean copying dance moves from Beat Street or mimicking the sounds of Tupac Shakur's rapping by studying the video of Holler If You Hear Me, as did members of the Palestinian group DAM, or DIM, in the early 1990s. But the globalization of hip-hop has not led to homogeneity. When the Ndlovu brothers formed a rap duo, they celebrated their heritage and called themselves Zimbabwe Legit. Their 1991 song, Doin' Damage in My Native Language, switches back and forth between English and Ndebele. Their music proudly asserts their African roots while simultaneously embracing US hip-hop culture and practice. Hip-hop has also become a way to preserve and disseminate indigenous languages around the world, whether Cherokee in North Carolina, USA, the Quechuan languages of the Peruvian Andes, or Sami, spoken in the northern regions of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Such cases represent a rich dynamic in which a cultural commodity exported by a global superpower is embraced as a means to resist the effects of commodification and globalization on endangered cultures. And by the way, I'm not going to go into detail about the other picture on this slide, BTS, which is the famous K-pop group. But the point I would make is similar, that K-pop was originally influenced by American pop, but now K-pop is so popular and has been, and is sung in Korean language and incorporates Korean culture. It is now being imitated by American groups. So there's this constant flow back and forth. And I'm not arguing against the potential dangers of globalization, but my point is that the mass mediation of music does not necessarily eliminate cultural difference, and in fact can allow for cultural differences to be celebrated. So now my final thesis. The study of music technology is the study of people. The study of technology would seem to be a study of machines and systems, and of course it is. But in my opinion, the most significant objects in the study of music and technology are not objects at all, but people. Popular histories of technology do, in fact, focus on people. They often celebrate inventors and innovators, the larger-than-life figures whose brilliance, determination, and vision are said to change the lives of millions and alter the course of history. These people matter, but I believe they have come to matter too much. Those who are identified most readily as inventors and innovators of music, modern music technology, represent a narrow segment of the population. They are typically men, often white, and usually come from the world's richest nations. A more expansive view is needed, one that acknowledges the contributions not only of the technologists who do not look like those in the pantheon, but also the much larger population of everyday users and consumers of technology. So take the example of musical hand clapping and rope jumping games of African-American girls. From a traditional view, these would not be regarded as technological practices. Why would they? There's nothing obviously technological about clapping hands or jumping rope. But the perspective changes when we accept the human body as a form of technology and define music technology as any tool or system designed to be or used to facilitate the creation, preservation, reception, or dissemination of music. And just to reiterate, these are points that I make in my book and in my scholarship in general, that I argue that the human body can be understood as a form of music technology, and that music technology is any tool or system used to disseminate, create, or preserve music. In her book, The Games Black Girls Play, ethnomusicologist Kira Gaunt puts it plainly. This is a quote: "The body is a technology of Black musical communication and identity. The purpose of considering these games as technological is not to elevate hand clapping and rope jumping, nor to diminish any other practices, but to insist that these practices be taken seriously and to see them as belonging to a broad spectrum of music technological practice. Accepting this wider view of technology prompts provocative, productive questions we might not think thought to have asked. For example, why are hand clapping and rope jumping games not typically deemed technological? Is it because they do not use what is conventionally understood as technology? Is it because they are games played by girls, by Black girls? The fact that the answer to both questions is yes ought to lead us to rethink our assumptions. The study of technology should be the study of people, all the people who create and use technology. The study of music and technology should be the study of how and why people engage with, conceive of, adopt, and adapt to technology as they create and experience music. It should seek to understand how our use of music technology expresses and shapes our identities, cultures, and politics. It should plumb and illuminate all the ways in which we develop and deploy tools to satisfy the ancient and ongoing human need for connection through music. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for giving your remarks in this very, very succinct, concentrated way. But there are really a lot of questions which arise. Just for example, the example of clapping hands and jumping ropes reminds me of how people from India and all over the world try to cope with lockdowns during the pandemic. Just for example, in India, there were a practice which is called Tali Bajo. I'm sorry, I will not pretend that my pronunciation of Hindi is nothing but incorrect, wrong. Anyway, Tali Bajo is a way of clapping bodies and clapping instruments with the body, which is, in one sense, nothing, not technological, but it was a technology of the self, and for imposing the self to a space which was not available in times of restriction. So this is really fascinating, thinking about this kind of ways, this kind of using the body in a technological ways. Anyway, I think that Alexandre will develop mostly the second point of your second remark, your second thesis, which is that our relationship with music is fundamentally collaborative, because I think that this case study will show how a musician actually collaborates with different kinds of technologies in order to do what he does. So I leave the ground to Alexandre for his case study about Toots Thielemans. Thank you, Alexandre.
So thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen and hear my voice. So as a contribution to this exploration of the relationship between music and technology, I'd like to offer a case study, that of Toots Thielemans, who was a great jazz harmonica player, a guitar player, which was also active in the fields of pop and film music. And as an aside, I should add that he was also a very gifted and successful whistler, which means that he was also one that used his own body as a musical technology. You'll notice from his dates of birth and that he had quite a long life and therefore a long career. And this means that he also experienced many of the technological developments that took place in the world of music in the second half of the 20th century, which I'm going to discuss here through a few selected themes. I'd like to start by pointing out that one of the most crucial and decisive choices in Toots Thielemans' career was actually a technological one. I'm referring to the choice of the chromatic harmonica as his main instrument. Perhaps surprisingly, the major consequences of this choice were less musical and technical than cultural. In fact, in the 1940s, the harmonica was a popular instrument, but often with a negative connotation, as it was associated with low forms of entertainment, such as vaudeville shows. And in the world of jazz, it was still fairly new, arousing curiosity, but still confined to the status of a novelty, or even regarded as a toy. And it is this prejudice that Toots Thielemans has had to contend with for most of his career. It's worth noting that although he was a remarkable harmonica player from the very beginning, his early career was viable only because he was also a guitar player. And indeed, it was as a guitarist that he had some of his first major engagements. The fact that the harmonica never entered the family of canonical jazz instruments is best illustrated by Downbeat magazine's famous annual polls, in which the instrument is included in a miscellaneous instrument category. And all this goes to show that the significance of technology goes beyond the purely technical, that every technology has cultural implication, and that making a technological choice means accepting to associate oneself with a series of meanings attached to that particular technology. The harmonica happened to be also strongly linked to another technology, that of the microphone. And when Thielemans began his career, many harmonica players like Larry Adler used what we call static microphone, which had the advantage of leaving both hands free, which is very useful for vibrato effects. But in the 1950s, some harmonicists preferred to carry the microphone directly in their hand, close to the instrument. You may have in mind some of the iconic microphones used by blues harmonica players, for instance, the famous Green Bullet. This is interesting on several counts, not only because these are some rudimentary technology, but sought after for their particularly dirty sound, but also because its use in blues music makes it a true second instrument in its own right, involving quite sophisticated gestures to produce highly contrasting and sometimes percussive effects. This, however, was not Toots Thielemans' horizon, as he always prefers simple, clean-sounding microphones, and typically used Schul's SM58 model for his concerts. This method of amplification, with the sound taken as close to the instrument as possible, had an impact on his instrumental technique, since it enabled him to play at moderate volume and create very subtle effects. So these three different schools that we could label the lyric one of Larry Adler, the blues one, and the jazz one are interesting because they show that there is not always a clear distinction between instrumental and amplification technology. The microphone acts as a direct extension of the instrument and, in turn, influences the musician's technique. And what appears to be a secondary element of technology turns out to be central. But there is more. Since its introduction a bit more than 100 years ago, the chromatic harmonica has undergone a number of design evolutions. From the 1990s onward, manufacturers experimented with synthetic materials and less conventional but more ergonomic designs. However, Thielemans has always preferred harmonica with a wood comb and traditional design, which were also the basis of his signature models developed by the manufacturer owner. For a musician, technological habits are sometimes very, very important, as illustrated by two anecdotes I'd like to share. So the first one shows that the world of harmonica is fascinating, not least because the instrument can be easily modified. One of the most common hacks is to modify the tuning of the instrument in order to be able to play certain chords normally inaccessible. And one day, a harmonica player showed Tielemans one of his customized instruments and had him try it out. And Tielemans found it very interesting, but also admitted that the very few modifications were enough to make him lose his bearing and that he would be unable to play the instrument on stage. The second anecdote is a bit more funny. One day, while setting up in a studio to take part in the recording of a motion picture soundtrack, Tielemans discovered the setup prepared by the sound engineers with lots of high-tech microphone equipment. And a little embarrassed, he kindly asked them to repack everything and just bring him a good old SM58, because that was the only thing he liked to work with. And this, I think, showed that the technology with which a musician is used to interact and which forms his usual environment sometimes constitute a precious ecosystem necessary for the smooth running of his performances. From the 1950s and especially the 1960s, the evolution of studio recording techniques and the stylistic evolution of pop music created new perspective for jazz musicians and a new professional reality in which to highlight their skills as improvisers, that of session musician. We are talking about a technological context that has now partly disappeared, when today entire album can be produced using using computer emulated virtual instruments. But back then, even so, some low budget production was necessarily based on the recording of a real instrumental performance. This gave rise to an economic reality where uncredited musicians were paid for performance. And for Tielemans and his peers, this was a godsend at a time when jazz was facing economic difficulties, especially as he had a particularly interesting profile, mastering both the guitar, which was at the time perhaps the most sought-after instrument, and being also among the few to play the harmonica at a professional level. And I think this goes to show that sometimes it is technology that creates and shapes professional context. So I'd like to conclude by explaining why in my doctoral research, it's important for me to develop an awareness of the technological dimension of my subject. In the course of my research, I often come across documents produced by technological contexts that have now disappeared. As someone born in the mid-1990s, I've had my very first experience with 78 RPM, acetate disc, reel tapes, and other kinds of technologies of the past. And I gained an interest not only in music technology, but also more broadly speaking in the information and communication technology that made Tielemans' career possible. And I believe that one of the technology jazz scholars must be most wary of is recording. Jazz was born almost at the same time as sound recording, and most jazz history continued to adopt 1917, the year of the first jazz recording, as the beginning of jazz history. What's more, most textbooks are based on the examination of a few canonical recordings, tacitly assumed to be a natural reflection of the music evolution. This overlooks the fact that recording, from both a technical and institutional point of view, represent a form of mediation. That is a complex filtration operation that decides which musical practices are to be recorded and commercially disseminated and which are not. This is what Jed Razula has called the seductive menace of records in jazz history. Instead, I think we should always ask ourselves to what extent the available documents are truly representative of the musical practice of a given musician or that of a given context. Let me give you just one example. In the 1950s, Toots Thielemans was a member of pianist George Shearing's famous quintet, popular for having invented a group sound combining piano, guitar, and the vibraphone. After recording from 1949 for MGM, Shearing concluded a contract in 1954, a year after Thielemans' arrival, with Capitol Records, where he produced a series of albums with a slightly different repertoire, each time juxtaposing the quintet's sound with that of another ensemble, a string orchestra, choir, brass band, big band, symphony orchestra, etc. And on these records, Thielemans is rarely heard soloing. Apart from that, the group toured North America Jazz Club for almost 40 weeks every year, playing the quintet's more traditional MGM period repertoire. Fortunately, few live performances, the core of the band's activity, survive in the form of broadcasts, nor released. And my point here is that if we were to confine also to the official discography of these years, we'd have a skewed picture of the daily repertoire of the band, as well as very little impression of Thielemans' musical language as an improviser in the 1950s. So my conclusion will be that the global heritage of recorded music, which combines direct and unmediated recordings of musical life and commercially conceived phonographic products, needs to be viewed with a critical eye if it is to be used as a historical document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Very interesting topic, a very interesting example for our seminar. If I had to sum up all the themes that emerged from your presentations, from your papers, I would say that there are a few ideas that we might develop in this discussion, now to open the discussion. And those are themes which emerged also from Mark's books, of course. And the first one is this distinction between pessimism and utopianism. I find very interesting that Mark posits himself in between pessimism and utopia, because we can, any utopian view of what music does finds a lot of places in history where music is used in a totally anti-utopian way. On the other hand, to absorb a totally pessimistic view, mostly if we think of technology, or if we think of technology in the terms of Marshall McLuhan, would be not correct, because as Mark showed with these cases, with some cases, the musical technologies can be used by people to overcome powers and to from oppressed people to go against power. So this is one of the main themes. If we consider music and technology as a way, as a possible paradigm to understand musicking in the history, in all its history. So it may be conceived as a overall new paradigm for thinking about musicking. Music as technology. This would be one thing. The second thing, which perfectly emerged from Alexander's presentation, I think, is the distinction between technology as a set of devices external or partly internal to human bodies, and techniques, the ways in which we use these technologies. And this distinction is somehow problematic because once upon a time I used to be an organist. And when I played organ, I used to play Bach in my church. We had a very modern pedal board, which was not straight, which was totally different from Bach's keyboard, pedal board, for example. Then if I had to move to an organ made in the fashion of Bach's organs, I had to totally change or partly change my technique to adapt myself to a new technology. Which is mostly the same technology. I use the pedals in the same way, but in partly different ways. The boundaries between technologies and how we use them through techniques is one which is very complex and which brings forth the necessity to study music in this way. And it brings to the last major thing, which might be locating agency, which is one of the things which mostly emerged from Marx's book and from all the debate about technological determinism versus social determinism. Locating agency is something as a political route because we need to rethink musical practices in new ways and refashion musical practices all over the history in new ways because we have skipped a lot of persons and a lot of agencies throughout the entire history of music, but it means also to reflect on causality. And that brings me to the last point, technological determinism, because locating agency means to dwell with technological determinism, whether technology drives history or humans using technologies through specific techniques drives history. There's no shared opinion about this, we can say. It's something like an undecidable question. I'd like to, Mark in his book is very precise in isolating technological determinism and declaring that we should be cautious when applying it. But I'd like to bring very briefly what a historian of media writes about technological determinism, which might be a starting point for our discussion. This scholar is John Durham Peters, who some of you may know because he wrote together with Eric Rothenbühler a very important essay on early recordings in the 90s. Anyway, John Durham Peters writes that the denunciation, I quote, of technological determinism in the name of popular agency not only underestimates the power of devices, but also overestimates the power of people. It provides metaphysical comfort by keeping subjects and objects in separate boxes. The claim that technologies should be subject to humans portrays our wills as immaterial and disembedded, as if we were not already networked features, as if matter were blank nothingness. The agency of human beings is a question we should answer, not a fact we should assume. The fear that technology would impose itself externally on humans is a form of denial that humans are already beings made by art. Things can be alive, and people can be machines. These inalienable truths are obscured by the charge of technological determinism. Of course, these are Peter's thesis. Of course, we can debate about it, but I think it's a good starting point for starting our debate. And also, if there are questions from the public at home, just write them on YouTube, and also in Italian, I will translate them. Anyway, I would like to ask some remarks to both Mark and Alexander about what I said, please.
Well, thank you. That's a very provocative argument that he makes, and I don't wholly disagree with him. I have a different, more of a different perspective, and I would say my view on technological determinism is not about trying to discover the objective truth about who has agency and who doesn't. It's more of a strategic approach, because what I see is people, in a sense, renouncing their agency and giving and ceding control to systems. And so people say, well, I can't help but I'm helpless to control how I use my phone, or we can't stop technology, and there's a lot to be said for why that is, because these systems are created in a way that seem to limit our agency. However, we have to go back to the point that these technologies that limit our agency were created by human agency. But my point is more strategic, in the sense that if we claim our agency, then we can do something about, we could do something more than just complain about technology. So, if we simply say, we're just helpless to respond to these technological changes, then it's in a sense a foregone conclusion that we're helpless. So I use it as a prompt for people to kind of to acknowledge their own agency, to understand that has limits, of course, but not to cede their agency in the name of technological determinism. So yes, I would oppose a little bit of what he says, but it's more that it's not a point that I'm saying he's just simply wrong. It's like, what is more of the question is, what is the point of talking about technological determinism? What is the point about talking about human agency?
Alexander, you want to add something on this?
Sorry, I think we have a question from the chat.
Yeah, but if you want to add something about this,
I totally agree.
Okay, there's a question from YouTube.
Yes, I see it.
A question for Professor Katz. Could musical conventions such as rhythmic or metric organization be considered technologies, or would they be more like the components of music as technology? It's a nice question.
That's a very interesting question. What I would say is, when we talk about metric and rhythmic organization, often, but not always, often we're referring to notated music, or music that is the metric or rhythmic organization is notated in a certain way. And notation, as well as printing, I see as obvious examples of technologies. Now, if you're just thinking more abstractly, would it be a technology? In a sense, I say it's up to you, because I have a very broad view of technology, which is just any tool or system that allows us to create, preserve, disseminate music. So in that case, I would say you could think about musical technique as a form of technology. And this is an interesting thing that Alexander was talking about, in terms of the kind of that interface between technique and technology. So my answer is yes, if you want to. That's my very unhelpful.
In the book, there are a lot of parts dedicated to musical notation as a technology, and I would suggest to everybody listening to this seminar to buy and read them, because they are very interesting, and there's a lot of research which is undergoing at the moment on that kind of stuff. Also, because we are trying to enlarge our view of technology, of what a technology is and what technologies do. One point remains, indeed, the separation between technology and technique. Just for example, in Alexander's case, they started to play the harmonica in a different way because they started to use microphones in a different way. So they implied the technology, the external device, into their own practice. And without those kind of technologies, those kind of microphones, they wouldn't have done that kind of stuff. They wouldn't have started to play that way, which can be said, the same can be said for crooning, for example. We know that crooning is much more than just whispering to a microphone. It's just more than a vocal technique. It's something which was born out of broader changes in the United States and in the male figure and the imaginaries of the male in the United States in the 1930s. But anyway, the inception of a new technology of those kinds of microphones permitted somehow that those techniques emerged. And so that's why I think that we should keep an eye at technological determinism as at least as an historical tool. And there are two ways in which we can bring inside technological determinism inside historiography, which is one of the problems. Does the microphone change the ways in which people sang? Yes. Does the ways in which people sang change the microphone? Yes. Just for example, it is going to be published a very interesting volume by, I read his name because I don't remember it, Jon Huger is going to publish a very nice book, which is titled How Music Changed YouTube, which is the inverse of what we are saying, how YouTube changed music, how music has changed YouTube and how users use YouTube through music. Going back to historiography, there's a second point, but there's another question from the public, so I will give the preference to that. I was thinking not so much about notation, but more about treating rhythmic patterns as actual sounds. I think it's something adding to the last question. So I was thinking not so much about notation itself, but more about rhythmic patterns as actual sounds.
Well, I think that's a very provocative point. I have to admit that I hadn't thought about that those as technologies. And the way I have a pragmatic view of definitions in the sense that are they useful? My inclination would be, well, maybe I would draw a line there and say the rhythmic patterns and metric organization would be in the realm of technique, not technology. But of course, they're so closely connected that we can argue where that line is. So I might put it back to the person who asked that very interesting question. What would it serve to think of rhythmic patterns as technologies? Would that be a useful way of conceiving it? Would that help us understand music in a new way? And if that's the case, I would say do it, because my whole provocation is to get us to think in new ways and expansive ways about music. So I'm very pragmatic, I have to say, about definitions.
Well, is there any other questions from the public? Or Alexandra wants to add something about that? Because we have reached the limit of the hour, which is the usual limit for our seminars. There's a lot of things that we could say. For example, this question, this distinction between notation and rhythmic patterns brings me memories, very ancient memories of when I studied medieval music and the tonarium, the tonaria, which were books in which we can observe this passage between people memorizing music and people starting to understand and play music from written sources, which is a very important moment. And there are some very interesting studies by Anne-Marie Busseberger about that, just for example. And that was a technological shift between memory as a technology for music storage and notation, which regarded precisely not only rhythmical patterns in that case, but also tonal structures. I would question: is a genre, musical genre, is a technology? Can we understand the genre as a technology or as a medium? Maybe a set of rules which should be respected or not respected in order to develop a message and transmit it to other people. There's a lot of questions which can arise, but I think that the topic of music and technology will be central as we are going to face innovations such as artificial intelligence. Just for example, I read about they are trying to produce new Beatles songs through artificial intelligence, which is something which we could not expect. They are not trying to reproduce a performance of the Beatles through holograms, like they already have done with Callas and a lot of other things. You mentioned K-pop. They are trying to actually build new Beatles songs out of artificial intelligence, which is of course out of others Beatles songs. Where's the limit between technology and innovation and artistry, etc.? So there's a lot of questions which can arise from this, but I thank Professor Katz, I thank Mark for his availability for this seminar. I thank also Alexander, not the public at home, and I greet you, and I will pass to Italian for the last remarks, ricordandovi che questo è solo il primo degli appuntamenti della serie AlumiLeviLive. Il secondo, vi chiedo scusa, lo recupero immediatamente, avrà luogo il 20 febbraio il prossimo 20 febbraio, avrà per titolo la divulgazione musicologica, organizzato dalla collega Eladia Fico con come ospiti il professor Marco Mangani e il professor Francesco Roccorossi. So, I thank everybody again, and I greet you. Thank you very much to everybody. See you on the 20th of February for the next episode of the AlumiLeviLive seminar. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.